Before we have lunch, I'd just like to welcome everyone. I'm Rhonda Diamond. I'm a member of the Glencoe League of Women Voters, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to the League of Women Voters' 18th Annual Women's History Month Luncheon. Women's History Month honors and celebrates the past and present struggles and achievements of American women. Women's History Month has its origins in 1981 when Congress authorized and requested the President to proclaim the week beginning March 7, 1982 as Women's History Week. The President then was Ronald Reagan, and he issued the first Women's History Week proclamation and recognized the vital role of women in history with the following words: American women of every race, creed, and ethnic background helped found and build our nation in countless recorded and unrecorded ways. As leaders in public affairs, American women not only worked to secure their own rights of suffrage and equal opportunity, but were also principal advocates in the abolitionist, temperance, mental health reform, industrial labor and social reform movements, as well as the modern civil rights movement. In 1987, after being petitioned by the National Women's History Project, Congress designated the month of March 1987 as Women's History Month. President Reagan was still president then, and he issued a proclamation calling upon all Americans to mark the month with observances to honor the achievements of American women. I've greatly condensed the history of Women's History Month into just a few paragraphs, so I've left out many names and stories of the women and the men who worked to make it happen. So please take some time this month, get the whole story at the National Women's History Project website. That's www.nwhp.org. A little bit about the League of Women Voters, because we have some guests here. The League of Women Voters was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt in 1920 during the convention of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. The convention was held 6 months before the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, giving women the right to vote after a 72-year struggle. The League began as a mighty political experiment designed to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters and encourage them to use their new power to participate in shaping public policy. From the beginning, the League was an activist, grassroots organization whose leaders believed that citizens should play a critical role in advocacy. It was then and is now a nonpartisan organization. League founders believed that maintaining a nonpartisan stance would protect the fledgling organization from becoming mired in the party politics of the day. However, League members were encouraged to be political themselves by educating citizens about and lobbying for government and social reform legislation. 91 years later, that still holds true. The League is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government, but always working on vital issues of concern to members and the public. The League has a long, rich history that continues with each passing year. Membership is open to men and women, and for more information about the League of Women Voters of Illinois, please visit the League website, which is www.lwvil.org. And we are very delighted to have Dr. Rachel Bronson with us today. We look forward to hearing not only about women's progress in global leadership, but her comments and remarks about what has been occurring the last few weeks in the Middle East. As a courtesy to our guest speaker, please remember to turn off your cell phones, and please enjoy your lunch.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good. So thank you, Charlene, and thank you to the League of Women Voters for having me here today. Just get all set up here. I'm delighted to be here today to speak with you for this Women's History Month lunch. The League of Women Voters has played a very important role in my own history, and it continues to serve an enormously important role in American society. When my mother moved from Queens, New York, newly married, with 2 small children, she found herself isolated in our well-heeled New Jersey suburb. The daughter of European immigrants, she knew well the sound of traffic, subway cars, and my grandmother calling her from their apartment window, calling her in to drink her milk, as she will tell me. The birds and those ghastly cicadas, which I know are still out here, and the utter quietness of our New Jersey suburbs was indeed charming, but to my mother, who was excited to be living out the American dream in the suburbs, it also seemed strangely remote and isolating. And in an effort to ensure that her life remained as stimulating in the suburbs as it had been in the city, she joined the League of Women Voters, an organization that promised her new friends, civic engagement, and a link into her immediate and national community. On her first day, at her first meeting, she met a set of women who formed the base of her new community and whose children I would later grow up with. And although my mother remained active in the League for just a few years after that, the League of Women Voters served one of its key purposes of continuing to connect smart, motivated women and men to each other. So I'm particularly glad to be here with you today. We went around, Charlene and I, on a number of different topics to talk with you about today, but it would be hard for me to speak to you on any topic other than what the riveting events in the Middle East. So I hope that those who came to talk about something else will bear with me as we open up the conversation on the Middle East. Although I'm happy to take any questions, including what it's like to do a taping of the Jon Stewart show in our discussion afterwards. It's always what gets everyone's most interest. What is going on in the region, stretching from North Africa, straight across the Persian Gulf, down south to Yemen. Can I move this back? No, I can't. Can I move this back, maybe? Let me just hold it, maybe. Oh, okay. Better. What is going on in the region, stretching from North Africa straight across to the Persian Gulf, down south to Yemen, and even south into the little island of Djibouti, which we're just starting to hear about and is strategically very important for the United States, and up north to Iraq is truly awesome. The whole region is undergoing a political upheaval, the likes of which we haven't seen in more than half a century. But I want to stop here and say half a century, not ever. You'll hear a lot of people saying it's unprecedented. It is not. And we were talking earlier about the challenges in the 70s, but going back to the 50s, what we've seen happening now has happened before. In 1952, the Egyptian military overthrew King Farouk, showing that monarchs in the region were not unmovable. Within 2 years, Gamal Abdel Nasser had consolidated power and electrified the region. The Jordanian monarchy immediately came under pressure. 1955 marked the beginning of a series of coups in Yemen, another country in the news these days, that involved Nasser's sympathizers. King Faisal II of Iraq, again in the news, was assassinated in 1958. Saudi Arabia was under significant domestic threat, and members of the royal family, the House of Saud, defected to Egypt in 1962. And then 15 years later, in 1969, Muammar Gaddafi overthrew King Idris of Libya, again in the news. This ended a region-wide series of coups that were inspired largely by events in Egypt. Revolutions inspired by Egypt raged from 1954 to 1969, and it's therefore useful to remember that even given how electrifying and seemingly fast-moving today's events are, they can take more than a decade to play themselves out. So we need to have some strategic patience as we follow the region, and know that today's earthquakes will be followed by tremors that will be felt for years, if not decades, to come. We are also reminded that revolutions in the Arab world really are contagious, suggesting that there is a political dynamic that seems to be uniquely Middle Eastern or Arab. There is a regional and cultural identity that causes people in Bahrain, 1,100 miles from Cairo, to think that events there somehow matter to them in a small little Gulf state, again 1,100 miles away. It is notable for now, anyway, that the revolutions are spreading west to east. They're not spreading north to southern Africa, at least not yet and not with the same speed. But it is an interesting question of why isn't Nigeria in the throes of revolution, but Bahrain and Yemen are a lot closer to it. The answer for why this might be the case is partly language and culture, and indeed ties that run across the Arab world in ways that are different, say, from North Africa to Southern Africa, or different from Gulf countries to South Asia. There's also a shared geopolitical context that I'll talk about shortly that ties the region together and makes it different from the adjoining African and South Asian states. So for now, let's just review how we got to where we are today. As most in the room probably know, the trigger for recent events was as unexpected as it was routine. In December, a Tunisian fruit vendor was humiliated when his fruit was confiscated and when he was slapped by a female government inspector and roughed up by her colleagues. After having his scale taken, being beaten, and being refused a meeting with the governor whom he had petitioned to protest, he set himself on fire and died shortly thereafter, and Tunisia responded. Tunisia's uprising and the flight of President Ben Ali emboldened Tunisia's neighbors in Egypt and throughout the Arab world. Social media like Facebook helped ordinary Tunisians and then Egyptians and then others organize and operate outside of the controls of the state. Until Facebook and other social media, the only place where many Arabs and Middle Easterners could organize easily and routinely was away from the state interference was by and large in the mosque. And Facebook and social media is providing another safe space that could and most likely will continue to affect politics as we move forward. Tunisians and then Egyptians and now others have adopted nonviolent tactics learned from colleagues around the world who had successfully employed such measures to throw off their own dictators. Young Tunisians and Egyptians had met prior to these events with Serbian counterparts who had successfully gotten rid of Milosevic. They studied what had worked and what happened. The Serbs, in turn, had been inspired by a Boston-based professor writing how-to manuals for nonviolent resistance. With internationally inspired techniques and new social networking technologies, a new dynamic in the Arab world is taking hold. And while Tunisia and Egypt and Libya and Bahrain and others are very different countries with very different sectarian, economic, and military realities, they do share important traits that are worth highlighting. So economically, these countries' citizens share a profound sense of relative deprivation. And relative deprivation is a term that social scientists have coined to say it's not just how badly you're doing. If you're doing badly and everyone else is doing badly, you can kind of live with that. It's that relative deprivation, how you're doing relative to how others are doing, or if things are getting worse for you while they're not for others, or even getting better for others, that's when troubling things start happening politically. In Egypt, the economy has been growing for over 5% a year lately, which is pretty good, especially in these economic times. But it needs to be growing a whole lot faster if it's going to create the jobs for its very young population. In Egypt, 32% of the population is below the age of 14. Compare this with only about 20% in the US. 34%, and the jobs at 5% growth are nowhere near as fast as they need to come online to absorb all those people working. So unemployment is just increasing, and people are understanding that their children will not do better than they, and in fact may do significantly worse. GDP per capita in Egypt is less than $6,000 a person. Now think of Libya. Libya actually has a very high GDP per capita, and it's one of the highest in Africa at almost about 14,000 because of its oil revenues. So is it possible to speak about relative deprivation when the country is doing significantly better than many of its neighbors? But even in Libya, it's quite possible because so little of the economic largesse has flowed downward. I just went to look at the numbers actually last night as I was preparing for this, and I was shocked. I knew it was bad, but Libyan unemployment is at a whopping 30%. A national unemployment ranking that puts it in the top 25 countries in the world, with 14,000 per capita supposedly, if you spread it around equally. So people are seeing that, and they have less and less. In Egypt and Tunisia, and to some extent Bahrain, rising food prices and the financial crisis have made it ever harder for governments to buy off the opposition or even make it marginally better in everyday people's lives. Bread riots in the 70s nearly toppled the Egyptian and Jordan regimes back then, and leaders today are well aware of the cost that high food prices could have on their political longevity. So that's a bit of the kind of economic story. But politically, each state is struggling also with regime transition. Egypt during the Mubarak era was ironically the poster child for this problem. And I say ironically because everyone tends to look at the monarchies of the Middle East, Saudi Arabia particularly, as the most likely next victims of the succession crisis. But the monarchies have been seemingly better able to manage their leadership transitions, more successfully certainly than their Republican counterparts. Leadership has passed easily in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, even Jordan. But in Egypt in particular, but elsewhere as well, the fact that there was no vice president and that more recently Mubarak had seemed to decide that his son Gamal would run the country led to extreme military and political concern. Now I remember about 10 years ago talking with some Egyptian counterparts, and the fact that Mubarak hadn't appointed a vice president was deeply grating and worrisome for the military in Egypt as well as normal citizens. Why was this? Why was this so important? Because when Gamal Abdel Nasser he overthrew a monarchy with the idea that there would be some sort of meritocratic way into the halls of power. Now, it was going to be the military, but the military was seen as an institution that would absorb different sects, different economic classes, and a lot of the poor and minority citizens went into the military. So even though it was decided by the military, it wasn't popularly elected, it was very important that they had this role. And so Sadat was Nasser's vice president, and Mubarak was Sadat's vice president. By not having a vice president, what everyone took was that he was waiting for his son to fill it. And sure enough, about 3 years ago, it became clear that he was looking at his son to replace him, which the military certainly didn't like, and as we saw, didn't support almost immediately as soon as things began to unfold. But also, I remember my colleagues saying, we are not pharaohs. Egypt had its day of the pharaohs, where it passed on from father to son, but that is our history, and we're more modern than that. So to go back in time to the age of the pharaohs was humiliating for most Egyptians, even though many people thought that Gamal Mubarak would actually make a plausible president. Because of his lineage, it actually made it harder for him to become so. So politically, all of these have been having struggles with who's going to be next. And then ideologically, what is so compelling about recent events is that radical Islamic ideology and sharp anti-Americanism isn't ruling the day, at least not yet. Despite the fact that the past 40 years, really since the end of the 1967 war, radical Islamic political ideology has been the soundtrack of Arab politics. This does not mean that radical Islamic groups are a thing of the past and far from it, but they are not the central ideological organizational principle that they have been in the recent past. They have not shown themselves to be as compelling to the youth movements that are carrying out today's revolutions. At this moment, the story is not about those groups. It is also not about America or Europe or Israel. This is not about outside interference. The protesters are very clear about this, that this is about political and economic stagnation and the desire for freedom of choice and freedom of movement and freedom of will. A new generation is emerging, at least for now. They are not convinced by the ideologies of the past decades, ones that have not served them or their region particularly well. This poses enormous opportunities for the United States and makes it all the more crucial that we continue to support that direction. If we widen the lens a little farther and extend our time horizon to think about what is similar about these countries and what is different, I would also suggest to you that what binds these Arab states together are certain economic and political realities that were put in place during the Cold War. And what we're actually seeing is the last tremors associated with the end of the Cold War. So what do I mean by this? Like every region in the world, the Middle East was affected by the Cold War. But the way it played out there was in many ways different. The region was divided, like elsewhere, into Soviet and US camps. And every single country, except maybe Morocco and to a lesser extent Yemen, received vast amounts of resources that did not rely on their populations. It's amazing when you kind of think through the states. Every single one of them were either confrontation states, that is, they were centrally involved in the Israel-Palestinian conflict, like Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria. and thus received significant aid from Washington or Moscow as those two great states played out the Cold War within Arab-Israeli politics. If they weren't confrontation states, they were oil states: Libya, Iran, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait. Iran, of course, not being an Arab state, but Middle Eastern. This meant that there was never anything close to a time when the population in the region could organize around a simple but important message such as no taxation without representation. There was never taxation. It wasn't necessary. Regimes did not need their people for their revenue. Political scientists call this a rentier state. They never relied on their people for revenue. They either had foreign aid or they had oil revenue. So the people were secondary to what was going on, and they didn't rely on them. When the Cold War ended, oil prices plummeted, and that almost spelled the end for some of the oil states. Saudi Arabia went through a very unsettling period in the 1990s when the regime was deeply threatened by Al-Qaeda and other radical groups. But as oil prices increased, so did the oil states' ability to spread wealth around and buy stability. Not so for the foreign aid states or the confrontation states. They are the ones that are going through the throes of the revolt, because over the past 20 years, that support has faded. Israel has been immune to this because of their investment in technology and the technological sector that was able to replace an agriculture sector. But it was one of the very few and rare exceptions. The U.S. kept supporting Egypt's military, but it hasn't increased its support and it has not poured it proportionally around the country. There's a greater need now in the region for populations to become productive and contribute to state coffers. But to get them to do so, they need to be, people will demand that they are represented. And the authoritarian political model has become unsustainable in the Middle East because the regime is not benefiting from the same kind of external support that it once received. As the influence of Washington and Moscow has receded, the regimes have begun to teeter. It has taken some time, but again, it comes back to strategic patience. These things take years, if not decades, to work their way through a system. So fast forwarding a bit back to the present, because I don't want to lose you all to history. One question that some of our counterparts are hammering out in Washington is whether to credit President Bush's freedom agenda to the day's events. That's something I've been thinking quite a bit about as well. Charles Krautheimer argued in Friday's Washington Post, and was on my mind, so I wanted to share it with you, that Facebook and Twitter have surely mediated, he said, this pan-Arab and Iranian reach for dignity and freedom, but the Bush doctrine set the premise. So thinking about it, I don't give the Bush administration's agenda that much credit for this. And what we're seeing for all these things that we're seeing, President Bush talked about liberty and that our freedom was safer if others were free. He asked rhetorically, if you remember, why shouldn't Arabs have democracy? Don't they want it too? But he did little to build and foster it. The Cedar Revolution in Lebanon in 2005 came to little, just as the Green Revolution in Iran didn't lead to the overthrow of the regime a few years later under the Obama administration. Bush focused on elections, and he got the elections in Palestine that he had called for and his administration had pushed hard for. But he got Hamas in power, which was not what he expected, and has roiled the region. For the Bush administration, freedom became about elections, and he presented and argued it in such a way that it became dangerous and appealing for those in the region to be considered democratic. In a world of global politics, moral suasion matters, and Bush was not able to convert his calls for an American idea of democracy and freedom into local language and results. I do believe the Obama administration is handling events in the region better, although it is not without serious flaws. When the Obama administration, where the Obama administration is excelling, I think, is what I've been saying is keeping one step behind the news cycle, because that is really where we should be at this moment. The administration is not out front of either the regime or our allies, but they are coordinating and maneuvering international efforts. They are keeping the international community organized and on message. We have seen very few examples of, say, the U.S. calling for sanctions while the Europeans are opposing it, or the kinds of international chaotic diplomacy that we saw just a few years back. Sanctions on Libya move relatively seamlessly through the UN, and military action is being contemplated through NATO and the no-fly zones rather than independently in capitals. This is an international response to a set of regional events and the Obama administration deserves credit for their part in that story. It would be helpful, though, if the Obama administration was more coherent in its public statements and had a public posture of how public posture was in sync with its private one. We've seen several occasions when the U.S. seems to be considering, let's say, a no-fly zone, and then the Secretary of Defense Gates says it won't work. Or when Secretary of State Hillary Clinton says Mubarak is stable, the Mubarak regime is stable, only to call for his ouster shortly thereafter. More importantly, our president, who is so rhetorically gifted, has not offered a simple narrative for how we and the people of the region should understand recent events and what the U.S. can do and where its red lines are. So while I think the administration has been fairly successful behind the scenes, a crucial place to be successful in international politics, they have been slow and somewhat disappointing in the realm of rhetoric, which is some in the opposition in the Middle East I think would find beneficial and helpful. So I don't want to go on too long, but I do want to take a few minutes and just talk about, so who's next? And you have the Washington Post piece in front of you, so I'll just run through it kind of quickly. As some of you know from reading that piece, as it was distributed, there's considerable concern that Saudi Arabia will be the next target of revolutionary fervor. Why is Saudi Arabia so important to our thinking? Saudi Arabia sits astride a quarter of the world's proven oil resources. It is also the only country that doesn't pump to capacity. What does this mean and why is it important? It leaves oil in the ground and it uses it for political purposes. So at moments of political or economic crisis, it can lower oil prices if needed by putting oil onto the market. This is very unusual. Most countries and companies pump to capacity when possible because of the profit motive. The Saudis see their oil as a political, as something that they have that brings them political power on the international stage, and they're right about that. So when unrest strikes Libya, as it has, the Saudis can and have credibly promised to put additional oil on the market, which tends to ease market panic, and it has. We've seen oil prices not spike as it could have, in part because of statements that the Saudis have made that they will put oil on the market. The other reason Saudi Arabia is important, and it's obvious, but it often gets less attention, is just that it's home to Mecca and Medina. So the billion or so Muslims worldwide who are religious turn to it 5 times a day to pray. Many Muslims around the world find this anathema that the Saudis have such an important part in the way their religion is presented, but nonetheless it is true. And that gives them enormous power on the international stage. And it's long been my contention that if you really wanted to see a clash of civilizations, the way you get it is a U.S. versus Saudi Arabia. And so we need to be very thoughtful about how we move and navigate that relationship, and so that it doesn't end up being that kind of conflict. So living right on top of Saudi's oil fields is Saudi Arabia's largest concentration of Shia Muslims, the minority in the country. A Sunni majority state, Saudi Arabia hosts an eastern province that contains about 15 to 30% Shia. So even in the eastern province, they're not the majority, but they're a very big minority. They have been badly treated by the Saudis. They rose up soon after Ayatollah Khomeini came to power in 1979. The Saudis treated them very badly then, and they've not trusted them before or since. In 2005, the current king began a very active campaign to try to ease the tension between the two groups, but there's still a lot of distrust, and rightfully so, among them. Saudi suffers from many of the liabilities that I outlined earlier and have outlined in the article. It's estimated that 38% of Saudi Arabia's 25 million people are 14 years of younger. Again, this is so similar to the Egyptian situation, 38%. And some 280,000 men and 270,000 young women will enter the job market every year, more than 500,000 people onto the job market every year. In spite of Saudi government's efforts, direct unemployment is close to 10%, and this does not take into account the lags in getting jobs, limits to the number of women seeking jobs, and disguised unemployment. Moreover, the U.S. Census Bureau estimates, this is a stunning statistic, that Saudi Arabia will grow from 25 to 34 million by 2030 in 18 years, in spite of a sharp decline in past rate of population growth. So why I don't think that revolution is coming to Saudi anytime soon, although you never want to see everyone predicting Middle East politics. They do have a succession in place. Saudis do know who's coming next. It's not as opaque as it's often presented. We have a crown prince who's supposed to be the next ruler, but he's very ill. So there's a second deputy prime minister, Prince Nayef, who's a so-so kind of guy, but he's in the wings next. And there is a process, if opaque, about the next leader. You may not like who the next leader is, but it's not the uncertainty that you've seen in some of the other places. Also, oil prices are high. The Saudis have benefited from high oil prices, and they're spreading it around. Some of you might have seen that the king just came out. He's been very sick, and he just got back to country, and he announced $37 billion going into the economy, clearly in response to what's going on. But he has the ability, and has had the ability over the years, to put it into domestic programs. He has been doing it actually quite effectively. But a $37 billion injection is quite an impressive injection. And that reforms have been in place. The last 10 years have been, the last, say, 5 years, since 2005, when the king took over, have been actually good for a lot of the reforms in the kingdom, if very slow. So I don't think it's coming to Saudi Arabia, but that shouldn't cause us to say, okay, there's nothing to worry about, because in the Middle East there's always things to worry about. So just a kind of final wrap up a little bit, if you will, about what I do worry about. If we focus too much on whether Saudi Arabia is stable or not, we come up with it's probably okay and we can move on. But there's other questions about Saudi and Saudi activity that I'm watching, and I think you should as well. The concern that I think should keep our policymakers up at night is the role of Saudi Arabia in what is happening in Bahrain, and we were talking about this a little bit at the table today. Bahrain is a tiny little state. As you know, it's been in the news quite a bit. Only about 500,000 people. Basically ran out of oil a couple decades ago, and the Saudis have been subsidizing them ever since. It's a Sunni leadership of a Shia majority state. Unlike the Eastern Province, in Bahrain, the Shia are the majority, and is less than 20 miles away from Saudi Arabia. So what happens there makes the Saudis very nervous. And there have been rumors that the Saudis have not only advising the Bahraini government, but maybe even sending some kind of military or intelligence support. This is not confirmed. It's kind of the kind of question that people are watching. But it would be disastrous if they were ever caught doing this. Imagine political protests being put down in Bahrain with Saudi help. I don't think the U.S. could stay quiet, nor could we stay on the sidelines. We would have to condemn Saudi activity should they overplay their hand. And if there's anything that will roil oil markets, even more than chanting Shia in the Eastern Province, it's a public and angry U.S. spat. So I watch Bahrain very carefully. In some ways, I think what's happening there is as, if not important, as what's going on in Libya. And a lot of it depends on how the Saudis react. So events that we're seeing in the region are far from over. On Friday, 1,000 Egyptian protesters marched on an internal security service building in Alexandria. A week ago, thousands were in the street protesting the military stranglehold on politics. We know that groups and countries will test new regimes. A few weeks back, Iran sent its ships through the Suez Canal, something they would never have dared to have done under a Mubarak regime. On Thursday, Egypt announced that it would not resume natural gas shipments to Israel, causing the Israelis to scramble and seek new permissions for using diesel and other substitutes. Politics abhors a vacuum, and we don't know who will fill it in a number of places. So much is still in flux, and it will take months, not years, if not decades, to sort out. So these are the kinds of issues that we think about at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And I invite all of you to come and visit our website, or better yet, come join us for programs that interest you most. We host over 150 programs a year, broken down into a series of program streams that help you organize it all. We cover a wide variety of topics. Our homepage this weekend, for example, we're featuring the work we do on women in global development, which could have easily been the subject of my talk today had the Middle East not been so riveting. Our organization is one of the 3 oldest foreign policy organizations in the country, and over the last 10 years we've been broadening our offerings and looking for ways to link further into the Chicagoland area. 2 of my terrific colleagues are here today. Neve King, Executive Director of Programs and Leadership, is right here at the head table, and Dawn Miller, Executive Director of Major Gifts, who oversees our President Circle and leadership members, is here as well. They're great resources to learn more about the Council, and I urge you to do so after our discussion. I cannot think of a time more exciting to be working on these issues or to be involved in the kind of work that we and the League of Women Voters takes on. In these times of social media and electronic news, our country needs new ideas for how to remain civically engaged and how to ensure that citizens remain educated, not just about topics and opinions that they are comfortable with, but with topics and opinions across the political spectrum. Together, our 2 organizations can accomplish a lot. We're both committed to public education. Your focus is more domestic, ours is more international. But if we do our jobs right, our two organizations can complement each other and hopefully lead to a more publicly engaged and educated citizenry. Thank you very much.
Anybody has any questions? Have a question about yes. What besides oil? What else do they do? Anything? Grow anything? Export anything?
They being Saudis, or they being the region, or they? Yeah. Well, it's a great question. Every country is different, and not much. So oil is a very big part. You may remember after 2001, there was a UN report came back and looked at just how far behind the Arab world is in development. From their own human capital to the kinds of things they export. Agriculture in certain Middle Eastern states is very important. In the Saudi situation, in Saudi Arabia, it had been subsidized, but in Egypt, agriculture is still very important there. Parts of North Africa as well. There's oil, there's natural gas. There's been a there's some minerals for export in parts of the Levant. So there's pieces to things, and each country is slightly different, but it is woefully behind in development in terms of what they produce. And I think a lot of that comes back to right after independence, right? You know, these countries became independent often somewhere around 20s and 30s. They went right into the Cold War where their governments were subsidized either by foreign aid or the oil that was, found. So there's a lot of work to do. You will see across the region a huge investment in human capital, trying to build up universities. You've seen a lot of these partnerships. Northwestern has a school in Qatar on journalism, and these leaders are very, very focused on how to kind of build human capital, but it doesn't build just by creating a university. And we know that, and they know that too. But if I were looking, and the conversations I've had over there is, it's great to build the universities, but where's your school of teaching? You know, you have your journalism school, and you have your math and sciences, and this school is doing that. But there's no teachers' college. And that's really, really kind of what the region needs. And they're trying to figure it out. But they have a long way to go. For sure, they have a long way to go. There was a question, right? Yeah.
Can you speak about, maybe briefly about Iran's vulnerability to terrorism?
Yeah, it's really interesting when you start talking about the events in the region, so this Tunisian sets himself on fire, and suddenly, Ben Ali regime is gone and the Mubarak regime is gone. But that's why I went back and talked a little bit about 2005. Lebanon, the Lebanese went at this about 5-6 years ago, and we know that 18 months ago, Iran was very volatile. And so there is something going on across the whole region. It's not just suddenly the spark that has caught fire. Iran, I do think Iran is a little more stable than some of the pundits that we hear about. They did go very viciously. They repressed their population and have seemed to have been successful at that. But where I do agree with many of the pundits is it does seem a matter of time. I don't think who knows, you never want to say not tomorrow because things happen so quickly. But what you do see the splits in the regime happening that usually do augur a sense of change. Like when you look at how regimes change, you look at where's the military? Well, the Revolutionary Guard is very loyal to the leadership. But when they start imprisoning family members of Rafsanjani, and when Karoubi and the guys who are running, their kids are, something is going on, and I don't think that's sustainable. So they will fight very hard to stay in power, and I don't think that we're just days, weeks, and I'll always say kind of years away, but I do think that a political process is moving in Iran that will slowly lead to change. There's a big debate in the Washington policy community about whether Obama did the right thing by not coming out more forcefully behind the supporters. Again, just from the analysis of the discussion, I actually think that the Obama administration was right not to get out of it. I don't think if he had gotten way out in front, he would have made any difference. We would have just been ineffective. But where I think he could play a role is to clearly be supportive of it. And so when they need us, when when they can actually help tip the balance internationally, we can be on the right side of things. So I think I do think he actually played it well, and I do think he's playing it well now, but I don't think, like Saudi Arabia, I don't think we're going to open the newspaper tomorrow, but you can invite me back and when I'm wrong and wag your fingers at me. Right here.
What do you see the significance of the fact that Iran has its warship or frigate go through the canal and the cessation or non-renewal of the gas contract with Israel?
Yeah, well, sure, sorry about that. So the question was kind of what do we make of the fact that the Iranians sent their ships through the Suez Canal and that the Egyptian government hasn't renewed the gas contracts? You know, I want to know more about the gas contracts. I want to understand if it was a political decision that was taken because they didn't want that contract, which would be extremely troubling, or because they actually can't repair it fast enough. So the Jordanians are also very dependent on natural gas and were not able to benefit when the Egyptians cut it off. So I think we need to learn a little bit more about why they cut it off. But if it was a political decision that the military leadership didn't want those kind of contracts, it does suggest a political affiliation that will not be good for the United States or for Israel for that matter. But I do think it will be problematic because the U.S. won't be able to sit on the sidelines if Egypt leads an isolation of Israel. So I think it's very important. I had somebody in my office saying, you know, not enough people are paying attention to, you know, how Israel will be affected by it. And my response was, but that's not the story right now. The story is really what's going on in the region. And the Israelis, I think, have been quiet about the situation, which has been helpful. But decisions not to continue the pipeline will be very troubling. And I think that really does bear watching about what were the motivations behind that decision. It could also be a lack of an ability to repair it and really get it flowing comfortably, in which case they may be making a political statement on kind of a fact on the ground. And in terms of the warships, just very quickly, it shows just exactly that. Iran is very good at trying to get itself in the headlines, and they're clearly trying to show their muscle, and that they're still not worried about what's going on in the region, and we should pay attention to what's going on. And it's kind of par for the course for the Iranians, but it does hint at what vacuums can allow. And so I don't think that the Egyptian military will be very comfortable about Iran sending ships by them. The Egyptian military does not like Iran. They're very anti-Iran. We know this from WikiLeaks, and we've known it before. So it just shows that this isn't their first, they're not able to keep the Iranians out now, which a lot of people in the region will be watching. Yeah, right here, and they'll come over there.
We've been watching the evacuation of so many people from Libya, from as far away as Bangladesh, and yet you said, why are the Libyans in the oil fields? Why so many thousands of people from other places?
It's a political decision. I mean, there's a capability question and a political decision. But on the capabilities, in some jobs, you know, it's just not having the ability to do the jobs that are needed. And in the Libyan case, there's also a political decision that these groups might be easier to manage, and that they'd rather keep people out of jobs. I mean, Libya is just such a different and odd case. You know, in the Gulf states where they have huge expat labor forces, it's largely because their population either doesn't want to do the job or can't do the job. And so companies don't hire their citizens because they don't want to have to, it's hard to fire local nationals, and there's a whole set of reasons and incentives not to, there's no minimum wage, so the wages can be very low. In Libya, it's just 30% unemployment is just shockingly high, and so there's, you know, political decisions as well as kind of the capacity and capability decisions. Okay, last question. I'm sorry, I'll repeat the question too.
I was a little surprised about the speculation about Iraq and Saudi Arabia, because I always thought of them as an extremely wealthy state, but that doesn't mean that this wealth is trickling down to the common people. And I know in Egypt that it was an economic powder keg, because you have well educated people that are working in restaurants and so forth. And then the reason, obviously, this king unloaded all this money into circulation is to increase that standard of living. But is that just a stopgap? Is there, this kind of gap between what people could be doing and what they're relegated to doing? Does that exist? What is the economic situation for the people in Saudi Arabia?
So the question of what's the economic situation for the people in Saudi Arabia, and the notion of it being a very wealthy state, and this injection of 37 billion, that the Egyptians are clearly not as well off. So what's the situation in Saudi Arabia? Saudi Arabia's gone through a really fascinating last 20 years. In 1990, they basically paid for the Gulf War, and there were big conversations and fights between Secretary of State Baker and his Saudi counterparts about how much the Saudis should pay for the war. And it basically became this very crudely stated, but James Baker would state it that crudely as well, which was, look, it was our blood and treasure for your butts in this, and you're going to pay for it. And that the ambassador at the time, the U.S. ambassador, says, if you bankrupt them through this, they will face bigger problems that will come back to haunt them. And Baker said that's their issue to work out. It was our boys and girls on the line. They're going to pay for it. We're not going to be in the red on this. And at the end of the day, if you look at the ledger, the U.S. came out equal or slightly ahead on the Gulf War, large part by Middle Eastern, Saudi in particular, funding. Why I say that? Because what happened in the 1990s was you had this legacy of the Saudi royal family spending lavishly in places like Monaco and elsewhere, plus the loss of significant revenue to pay off the Gulf War, and low oil prices. And that combination led to a GDP of $9,000. So Saudi really, I mean, we don't kind of think about it because we have those images from the 70s and 80s, but the Saudis took a real hit to the point that they were days away from paying their U.S. bills, which would shut down our government, given how much in terms of military support and contracts and everything. So the 90s were a terrible, terrible time for the Saudis. Since then, a number of things have happened. Oil prices have gone back up, and in particular, this new king has indeed been undertaking a set of reforms of things like getting Saudi into the WTO. That has a number of things, not only making it a more normal market, but it does force out some of the corruption that existed. If you can't pay, as WTO rules, can't pay certain kind of side bets and things like that, it takes out some of the corruption. So he was using international organizations to try to normalize his own society. The religious police were kind of pulled back in. Locally, you could see that in talking to people, talking to Saudis, but you could also see it at conferences, at malls. Like there was a time where you could go to the malls and be like, there's one, there's one, there's one, and then you'd go back, they weren't as prevalent. I mean, so there was the whole environment kind of changed, and that's why, any of the analyses that you see on Saudi is that, look, they still move too slowly for our preference, but they also look around and they don't see a lot of models for how to do this well, whether they look in Iraq or Iran. I mean, they don't want any of that. Algeria, it used to be, they would look to. So, getting back to your question, so the king's injection of $37 billion falls on top of kinds of investments that are actually consistent. He hasn't made those kind of massive injections. But for the first time, either a year or two ago, the education budget was higher than the military budget. You see a transformation over. Now, there's still a lot of problems with that, right? The curriculum is still terrible. They have a a minister of education that doesn't move particularly fast. Those in this room can probably appreciate the challenges of that, even more so over there. So, but the reason that that injection of people have a feeling that if they can keep the king alive, he's 86, 87. The better off Saudi Arabia will be. So if they can kind of keep him, as long as he's there, people think it's moving in the right direction by and large, not true of everyone, but many Saudis and certainly many observers. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very, very much.